Hey, welcome back for the second half of our lecture on Hobbes. So I left you last time with a bit of a cliffhanger, like almost literally. If we were in the state of nature, I could be hanging you over a cliff because I want everything that you have, right? Because the state of nature is a state of war, of all against all, in which I would take you. In any case. So at this point, we might wonder, given that the state of nature is so horrible, what the heck can we do? How could we escape this state of nature? Because we've forgotten that this is mostly a thought experiment. We're not actually in the state of nature. But in any case, what could we do? How would we escape this state of nature? Well, Hobbes has a solution for this. You remember that there were two dominant passions. One was our pride, which drove us to try and take everyone else's stuff and come out ahead in the balance of life. But the other one was our fear. Now, fear is more ambiguous because we don't want to appear to be the last in the race of life, but fear leads us to be more cautious. Fear is our worry, especially our worry that somebody's going to come along and kill us. And for this reason, fear is actually helpful here. And this is where Hobbes is going into more of a normative mode than simply a descriptive mode. Because Hobbes thinks that it would be great if human beings could develop their fear instead of developing their pride. You can see this is where Hobbes actually goes in a different direction from Machiavelli. Machiavelli wanted you to develop that virtus, that manly passion. But Hobbes says, whoa, we've got too much of that, actually. What we need is a little bit more fear, to be a little bit more afraid. And if we activate our fear, then our fear can deploy our reason. Note the order there. So I said last time that reason is a servant of the passions and the appetites. If Hobbes believed that human beings were fundamentally rational creatures, we might not need to even focus on fear at all. I mean, couldn't a rational person in the state of nature just calculate this out? Like, you know what, this is not good for me and it's not good for you. Why don't we make a rational agreement with each other that this is not the way we're going to go? The problem is that Hobbes doesn't believe that we're rational creatures. Hobbes believes that we're fundamentally moved by our appetites. So we have to develop our fear in order to engage reason. And it's only after we've gotten appropriately fearful of other people killing us that we'll be able to deploy reason and come up with something that would be a useful solution to the problem of the state of nature. It's at this point that Hobbes brings in the idea of the natural law. This is cute, right? Because we've heard natural law before. I mean, in some sense, we could go back and we could say even before there was the term natural law, like Aristotle had the idea that people had inherent structures, and then the Stoics developed this into a theory that there was in fact a natural law out there in the world, and then Thomas Aquinas said, yes, because we have reason and our reason engages with God's reason. It allows us to know the natural law, have the general precepts which we apply in our societies. Now, Hobbes talks about natural law, but don't confuse what he's doing with what those figures have done before. Because what Hobbes means by natural law is not some rational and universal rule that all people have access to, especially not through kind of abstract reasoning. He thinks that the natural laws are rules of thumb that people would come up with once they've activated their fear. So they're kind of prudential conclusions that you might come to as you think about, you know what's a better way of living than in this war of all against all where we're always killing each other and taking each other's stuff. So the natural law, like reason, is not original. It's in many ways created by human beings who, now projecting their values out on the world, want to put that into a context where they could realize more of those values, or they could act more effectively on their own appetites and fears. So they create the natural law. Now, Hobbes actually articulates eventually 19 different natural laws, and I'm not going to go over all of them, although, it would be worth looking up sometime to see what he thinks they are. I will highlight the first two that he puts forward because they give us an idea of what he's thinking and where he's going here. So the first natural law, he says, is that every man ought to endeavor peace, as far as he has hope of obtaining it. And when he cannot obtain it, that he may seek and use all helps and advantages of war. Well, how does this first statement of natural law help us out? Well, it prioritizes peace over war, which makes sense. If you're doing this, you're activating your fear, and then your fear is driving you to reason. You say, you know what, if I had an option between these two, I would rather have peace than war. Of course, I'm not going to give up on the possibility of war because I'm going to defend myself, I'm going to defend my goods, I'm going to defend all of that. But if there's a way to stay peaceful with you, dude, I'm down with that. The second natural law follows on this. A man be willing when others are so too, as far forth as for peace and defense of himself, he shall think it necessary to lay down this right to all things, and be contented with so much liberty against other men as he would allow other men against himself. What does this mean? He says, well, here's the deal. Maybe we should make an agreement about this. You know, life out here in the state of nature sucks for you and it sucks for me. And it sucks in part because we all have a right to everything. And we all have equal power, yo. So, I just said yo. We've all got equal power. So if we wanted to solve this, maybe both of us could give up some of our rights. Maybe you could give up, say, your rights over these things that I have behind me in my pile, and I could give up my rights to those things behind you that you have in your pile. And if we did this, then, hey, we'd start to recognize that we each have our own property, right? This sounds cool. We could make this agreement for our own interest because both of us have activated our fear, and now we're acting more rationally because our reason is being activated by our fear. So basically, entering into these agreements with each other is in some sense a process of surrendering what you had in the state of nature in order to gain yourself a more stable life. So I give up my rights to a set of things like your life, and you give up your rights to the same things of mine. So you give up a right to my life. And we say, okay, I'll surrender those things to you, you surrender them to me, and we'll be able to actualize a greater peace between us. Eventually, this will lead to the development of a full-blown social contract, specifying all the different standards. So what kind of laws would you come up with if you wanted to enter into a social contract to protect yourself, you remember? You might say, okay, here are the laws we're going to agree to. So like, no murdering, no stealing from each other, no taking each other's spouses, right? You notice anything about this list? Yeah, you do. Because the list of the things that you might produce in terms of the natural law overlaps with the 10 Commandments in the Old Testament. So Hobbes can actually agree with Thomas Aquinas that the content of the natural law is stated in some sense in the Old Testament 10 Commandments. As a matter of fact, Hobbes would go further. He would say that basically what you'll get out of the social contract is an agreement to the golden rule. So do unto others as you would have them do unto you, except for that Hobbes would say it, well, avoid doing to others what you want them to avoid doing to you. So he thinks we get the golden rule out of this, but we don't get it out of reason and rationality, and we don't get it out of love of God or love of each other. We get it out of our own selfish negotiations in order to come to an agreement of what we need in order to establish a more settled society. Now, at this point, we still have a problem, because even if we've come to agree on the particular laws that we want to go by in the social contract, we still aren't sure that we can trust each other. And this is a good question, because as a matter of fact, if we agree to these laws and one of us follows them and the other one doesn't, well, guess what? That one's going to get ahead. And we're still prideful, egoistic people, so as soon as you see an advantage, you might take it. Let's say if you find a hole in the tax code today, right? Will you take advantage of that hole in the tax code? Well, you better believe you will. This is the problem, is that everybody, if they can figure their way around the laws, or if everybody's back is turned so they don't have to follow the laws, well, they don't, because they're still selfish, prideful people. So how can we solve for this? Well, if we want some reason that we wouldn't break the laws that we've agreed to, maybe we could find a solution that has to do with that fear thingy again. Is there anything that we fear, that we could fear in the society? You know what? I think there is. Let's produce a hierarchy. Let's produce government. Let's produce somebody to enforce the law that we've made with each other. And it's at this point that we get to the Leviathan. So the Leviathan is an Old Testament monster that's mentioned in Job. And in ancient mythology, the monster, the Leviathan, is a supremely powerful creature. Well, says Hobbes, what we need at this point is not just to trade off our rights, we need to trade off our power. So just as we've traded off our rights to kill each other, let's trade off our power. Let's give that into a central government, the sovereign. Now, the government at this point is an abstract thing, the sovereign. And the sovereign stands for our own power, our will, which we hand over to the police and the military and all of those branches of this government. So we say, you know what? We will take away every individual's power to kill so that no one has a right to kill anymore except the government. And if you break the laws, if you kill somebody, then the government will come back and kill you. The government is the abstraction of our will and our power. It is, in some sense, an embodiment of all of the people, the power of all of the people who have entered into the social contract. So it is just like a big person made of all the people that are members of the society. And here you can see actually a picture that's taken from one of the early printings of the Leviathan, which it's colored. So the original wasn't colored, but it makes it easier to see. Here you have the Leviathan, the king, who is made of all of the different people. And he wields in his one hand the sword of the military, and his other hand he has the scepter of the church, so that he is really absolute in his power over everything in the society. It is the Leviathan who gets to choose what goes for religion. It is the Leviathan who gets to choose what is taught in school. It is the Leviathan to whom the society has given its power in order to gain its security. Now, what kind of shape should this government take? Should it be a democracy? Should it be a republic? Well, I don't know if you've noticed, but I think he looks like somebody that you've seen before. Is there, can you see it? Can you see? Yeah, oh, yeah, he does. He looks kind of like Charles. I mean, I'm not into the hair and everything, but I guess he was. So Hobbes makes the argument that you don't want a democracy or a republic. If you enter into a democracy, you're basically leaving everyone in a state of nature. They still all have equal power with each other, and they're still going to be fighting about everything. Realize that in Hobbes' society, he doesn't even imagine that you could have a virtuous populace, a mixed government that would be of the aristos or the best. No, I mean, everybody's going to be pursuing their own wants. The government will fall apart far too quickly. So what you really want in order to maintain security is a strong monarch, an absolute monarch. Okay, now let's state some problems and some qualifications at the end of Hobbes' thought. You can't turn the world of political thought upside down without upsetting a few apple carts of thought. I don't know. Okay, so one problem we have is that Hobbes seems to think that life under the sovereign, under the monarch, the absolute monarch, will be better than life in the state of nature. Now, will it really be better? I mean, we've handed over power to this absolute monarch who will still be a character that's driven by his own pride, by his own fear, right? Or I guess entirely possibly by her own pride, by her own fear. So what will stop that monarch from abusing power? Hobbes doesn't have an entirely clear answer for this. He does believe that the power of the monarch is derived from the people and that the monarch's job is to maintain the social contract. But how low can that go? I mean, what level of survival are we willing to accept in society? As John Locke eventually says, a guy we're going to talk about in our next lecture, have the sheep really traded in their power to a wolf that they've put in charge of them? Now, we could imagine a kind of Machiavellian leader providing some duty to the society, but Hobbes doesn't even have that because his leader isn't even as moral as Machiavelli's leader. So it seems that the only thing that would restrain this leader is prudential calculation. Presumably the leader couldn't go against everyone in the society, lest the leader become hated. Here we can draw on Machiavelli. And so perhaps the leader has a need to keep most of the people happy. But that wouldn't protect any minority in the society, any minority group. As a matter of fact, it seems that the Leviathan could at any time crush a minority in society, not for having broken any of the laws, but simply not for being the people that the monarch likes. Hobbes doesn't really have a solution to this other than saying, look, it's something you're going to have to accept because the other option is going back to the state of nature, and nobody really wants that. So Hobbes does not have a good option for holding a monarch accountable. He does not sanction anything like a revolution against the monarch when the monarch has overstepped his authority. He thinks that that would be a really bad option because the state of nature is so horrible. Second, here's a fascinating question. So Machiavelli, who overlaps with Hobbes in many ways, goes in a very different direction in the end because he wants his leaders to be heroic individuals who take on the virtue of virtu, this manliness and this kind of assertiveness of self. But by the end, Hobbes has gone in the direction of fear rather than pride. As a matter of fact, he thinks that what we need in order to live in society with each other is more fear. Enough fear that we stop being those people who will be courageous and heroic. Those are the people that lead to chaos in society. Those are the kind of people that led the Republican Revolution in England and brought about years and years of catastrophe there. We don't need heroic figures. He says we need people who are afraid and calculating in order to figure out how they can avoid death and pain and work all of this out. And the question is, has Hobbes created the bourgeoisie? So this is a French term that is used by Jean-Jacques Rousseau later on and by Karl Marx to name what emerges from the period of modernity as this group of people who are not like the nobles. They are not motivated primarily by pride. They are not motivated by manliness. Rather, they calculate. They look at how much money they can get. They store it up in little banks. So, at the end of the day, has Hobbes created a new kind of person? Today in economics, they assume that people are practically rational. And by that they mean selfishly rational in a practical way. Do human beings calculate out what's best for themselves and work that out in their lives so that, as a matter of fact, you could figure out what society will do by running mathematical equations because everyone is this kind of calculating individual. And as a matter of fact, it's built into our language today that we say, like, there's social capital, as if Like our social relationships are part of what we own. You can think back to Hobbes and the idea that we own children, right? We can talk about, well, what are the costs and benefits of doing this as opposed to that? And in some ways, the people that think this way, we think of them as the CEOs of our society. But have we turned society now over to a group of accountants? This seems a strange conclusion to get to from where Hobbes began, where he looked a lot like Machiavelli. But it might be that Hobbes has actually started us out towards a world of bourgeois values, where we'll fear death really more than anything else. We won't like pain. We'll enjoy pleasure, and everything will become kind of less and less meaningful as we go, because we don't really want to buy into any project that would lead us to risk ourselves in any significant way. Well, something worth thinking about. That's why I put a tie on here. Another question with Hobbes has to do with, in retrospect, whether we should think of him as primarily an absolutist or kind of a beginning for liberalism. Now, most obviously, he's an absolutist. He was arguing for an absolute monarch, and I don't think that he's actually trying to trick anyone here. He's not being Machiavellian. This is his goal. But one of the reasons why nobody liked his book when it came out, why even the royalists, those fans of King Charles II, did not like his book, was because they saw immediately what Hobbes had done. You remember from the medieval period, we had the doctrine of the divine right of kings. So kings gained their authority directly from God. And so you couldn't challenge the king in any way because the king's will was right. It was given to you directly from God. Thomas Hobbes, while he's making an argument for the monarchy, has instead grounded their authority in an agreement of the people, a social contract. And he's introduced language that will be central to the liberal tradition from here forward. So if we talk about people being born equal with inalienable rights, I mean, that's what Hobbes says. Now, he doesn't mean what the later liberal tradition means, but he's starting out with individuals, and he's starting out with their rights, and they make agreements in order to protect their individual rights. This, in many ways, is obviously the beginning of modern liberalism. So we can think about Hobbes in both of these ways as a kind of paradoxical figure that is both making an argument for the fundamental political structures of the medieval period, but he makes them on a modern basis that eventually will erode underneath the monarchy. A final problem for Hobbes is this one. When did I sign the social contract? So, presumably, all of this has been a kind of thought experiment. Hobbes doesn't actually mean that there are people who make a social contract and write it down. I mean, we would have to come to, like, I don't know, America before anybody would actually think that literally about a social contract. But Hobbes doesn't think that way. So if it's the case that political society gains its authority from the agreement of the people, when did I sign the social contract? When have I handed over my rights and my powers? I don't remember doing that. Well, later thinkers will be a little bit more bothered by this than Hobbes is. John Locke, who comes next, will try and give a little bit more robust answer. But Hobbes is not as concerned about it because he's got a rather loose understanding of what counts as agreement. So in one place, when talking about slavery, Hobbes actually categorizes most of the people we would think of as slaves as servants. And he does that by saying this. He says if one person conquers another one in battle and holds their life in the balance, that person who is held can agree to being a servant to the other person either by an affirmative answer or by some other sign, like accepting the rule of the other person. So imagine that I was in a fight with you and I was holding a knife to your neck, and you said, you know what, in exchange for my life, I will serve you for the rest of your life. And, just don't kill me ever. And so you became my servant, and I never let you out, and you never made any money, and you just worked for me for the rest of my life. I basically controlled your liberty and all. Well, Hobbes says, no, that's not really slavery, because there's a kind of agreement between the two. It's only really slavery, says Hobbes, if the person is constantly fighting against you and constantly attempting to escape, so that they remain constantly in a state of war against you. He says, actually, the other person has entered into a kind of contract. That's the relationship between these atomistic people. So the other person has actually entered into a contract with you that they've agreed to serve as your long-term servant, right? Now, today we would consider that slavery, but he's willing to say, no, in that case, conquest really is a kind of agreement between the two. Well, if this is the case, then you don't ever really need to have affirmatively signed anything in political society. The fact that you're not rebelling means that you're going along with the social contract. You have, in fact, handed over your power and your rights because you've decided not to fight against everything in the society. You've decided not to fight against the sovereign. That appears to be enough to say you're on board, at least for Hobbes. Now, modern contract law, that would not get you by. But for Hobbes, he's still a little bit medieval in some ways. All right, so let's conclude by putting Hobbes together with those themes that we've been treating so far in class. And we will recognize that at this point, everything has gone wild, wacky into upside down world, because Hobbes does not match with most of what we've had go before. All right, human nature. Humans are egoist, driven by their passions, above all fear and pride. So in some sense, Hobbes's person is Augustine's sinner, and looks a fair amount like Machiavelli's person if they were a kind of mixture of the worst parts of the nobility and the lower class. Hobbes does hold out hope, though, that they could be socialized by developing their fear and engaging their reason. And maybe this would turn them into a kind of bourgeois person. Social or individual? For Hobbes, humans are self-made individuals. They determine what is good by the choices that they make. And society comes into existence only if individuals choose to create it. Realize how backwards that is in comparison to Aristotle, who says, no, every person is born into a society. There could not have been human beings if there had not been a society that came before them. And the society is prior to the individual and the family, and both of them start out owing the society. By the time we get to Hobbes, he says, no, come on, individuals come first. And individuals choose what society they want to have or whether they want to have a society at all. People and property. In the state of nature, all individuals have rights to all things, so there is no such thing as private property. Private property is created with the development of the social contract, inasmuch as I give up my rights to what you have, and you give up your rights to what I have. However, power over private property is given to the sovereign because we give up our own power and hand that over to the sovereign. And the sovereign can use this in order to maintain peace and security in the society and for many other things that the sovereign might want to do, since the sovereign is still a prideful person who's an egoist. So probably the sovereign will take a fair amount of property in the form of taxes and build up their own castles and whatever else. You saw the bloomers that Charles II had. They're right there. That costs a pretty penny, right? And for the most part, as citizens, there's nothing we can do about this, and we wouldn't rise up in rebellion over it because we don't want to end up back in the state of nature. Equality or inequality? Well, individuals are naturally equal in their rights and powers. Here we have the language of the liberal tradition that will come after Hobbes. In order to save ourselves from the state of nature, however, we enter into hierarchical relationships. we create the government, and we create someone to enforce the laws that we put forward. So we empower a police force, an army, and the monarch above all else. So in this creation, we give up some of those equal rights in order to gain our basic survival and our more basic rights against some of those that might appear more frivolous once we've engaged our fear and gotten over our pride. The shape of government for Hobbes is an absolute monarchy established by the social contract. So there shouldn't be a democracy or a republic because those will continue the state of nature into a new period. Rather, we should hand over all power to a unified and central government, the central sovereign in the monarch. To maintain the social contract, the government should provide security to the citizens of the state. This is the proper role of government. However, we shouldn't go too far with what it's supposed to do because, again, the sovereign has the ability to come in, take our property, and basically do whatever the sovereign wants to do, short of putting us in a situation as bad as in the state of nature. If it put us in a position as bad as the state of nature, then I suppose we'd rebel, although by that point, we'd really be in the state of nature anyway, because everybody would be fighting against each other and it'd all be chaos. What authorizes leadership? Well, here we come back to the social contract. Now, I won't go quite as far as we will with the next thinker. I won't say that it's really the agreement of those who are ruled. John Locke will go that far, although, as we've noted with the social contract, it's not actually an individual agreement that people make. Hobbes doesn't imagine that there's a process that authorizes the leader, that everybody has to vote or something in order to figure out who the king is. He believes that the social contract is a social order that's established, and that we can think about this, and by contemplating the thought process, we can find that this is in fact in our best interest to exist under the monarch, and that we'll accept that. And accepting that is tantamount to accepting the social contract, and so that's enough to say that the monarch is authorized by the social contract. All right, so at this point, we've clearly entered into modernity, and Hobbes has taken us from the medieval period into a brave new world. And where we're going to go from here could have been anybody's guess. But we know how it ends up because we live on the far side of Locke and the development of democracy. So next time, we'll come back with another modern thinker, John Locke, and we'll look at how he uses the basic pattern that Hobbes has laid out to come to a completely different conclusion. That in the next lecture.